I feel like when we think of kind of Indian films or like things coming out of Asia, because of how recently colonialism happened, that's kind of the lens that we watch it through. That's kind of like the movies, like a lot of the movies that like get popularity here. It's kind of like drawing some sort of story related to that or completely unrelated story where this is probably civilization wise one of the first civilizations like ever, right? Because of the valley and shit, right? But in terms of kind of them having a very complex story that's not really related to this 200 or 300-year view that we have. There's like a 3,000-year
Hmm.
stories, right? So the fact that he's kind of taking that on in India at the scale that he's taking it on, especially like if you go by like some of our comments, a lot of people mentioned that no one tried to take it on at this scale to talk about these stories, and now this has almost caused like a cultural shift where although these movies might have existed prior, he has kind of somehow managed to bring it into the mainstream to give it like a massive spotlight. And that's all to say, it's 2 cents for me. I do think there's some kind of, you can see, I was talking to Admir about this before we started. You can see an RRR in ways that he has improved from a storytelling perspective, from building a fantasy story perspective, from Bahubali. You can see in the 7 years how much he has come as a director. That's not to say that Bahubali is necessarily like a much worse movie or a bad movie, but you can see just little things that he's getting right as compared to the initial 2015 movie. So, it's definitely not a faultless way to kind of go about it, but I do applaud his courage and kind of bravery in terms of taking on such a big project. And obviously, it being a hit, and we also didn't mention yet that this movie, both parts of this movie was made in one kind of not one take,
Hmm.
but it was made as one movie. Then they just chopped it up at a part where it was appropriate to have a second movie because dudes were just like 5 hour movie, no one's gonna watch that. You need to like cut it. So they almost did it in like, for the lack of like a better comparison, I think Sam mentioned like Lord of the Rings, where you just make it and then they come out back to back, right? So the fact that he was able to take on like a kind of such a big kind of project and still come out on top, I'm definitely high on that. And I'm generally high on fantasy epics, but I do think that you guys can contest me on this. I don't think we haven't had like a any like great fantasy epic from like that's kind of that's like Western based in at least in the last decade. I would say I don't know if Avatar would count, but I
You
don't
mean
know if
that's
Avatar
based
exists.
in like a true source
Yeah, like
story?
some level of
Yeah.
realism. Like I'm willing to consider Greek mythology stories in this too. Like
Hmm.
any sort of kind of like godly situation going on, and then a hero's journey type movie. I don't know if we have gotten a lot of like kind of
We haven't got the movie,
decent ones.
but like I would say, Game of Thrones is the only thing that
Yes,
probably
Game
comes
of
to
Thrones,
mind.
and even then, Game of Thrones is like, is it really
But
the
that's
story of
based.
like one
That's
dude
just.
from like going from
It's
like bottom to the? This is like these movies are built in such a
Yeah.
kind of like you
right.
could almost call them linear to an extent, but it's not a bad linear. It's a good linear where you kind of know the progressions that
Hmm.
the story is taking, and it's not trying to be like funny
Also,
or ironic when it's not supposed to be. You know?
these are based on recent fictional books too, and I think to your point, Fahad, it's rare that we get one, and of course because of just how young America is and just the lack of like a super deep rooted like 1,000-year-old culture here, but we don't get those original like folkloric or mythological stories much
Exactly.
here. Like the most
Exactly.
recent one, I know we were talking about a
Exactly.
little bit about this off camera, but 300 is one that comes to mind.
Exactly.
Relatively recent, but we could talk about the merits of like where you put that up in the grand scheme of films.
Yeah.
But it does feel like the genre is something that we rarely get over here in America. We
Exactly.
get it definitely based on like fiction sources for sure. Like Dune obviously came out
Exactly.
last year or the year before. I'm losing track of time now. But
Yeah,
yeah,
last year.
I'm not
But
sure what the last one was that was based on a source.
exactly. Yeah, that's why I'm just like, yeah. No, Admin, you're gonna say something.
No, I do feel like this grand blockbuster sort of approach to like mythology films. So like the Greek and I think Roman mythology has been mined quite a bit by Hollywood,
Insane
and
amount.
so
Hmm.
Yeah.
yeah, so the reaction that I think you'll get from audiences is quite apathetic.
Exactly.
However, you do have you have the Vikings TV show, for example, or you have like God of War leaning into Norse mythology. So you do have Marvel does it a little bit as well in sort of their cinematic universe.
Yeah.
So there are Western mythologies that haven't been sort of mined as much as sort of the Greek and the Roman. And I think we mentioned it at the top that this is relatively new in Indian cinema, right? Where you have this sort of blockbuster approach to the mythology that has been in their culture for so long. So they're sort of starting to explore that. And you have to ask sort of, does Hollywood have the same incentive to explore mythology in the same way? I think if let's say you give the resources of Hollywood to a Norway or to a Scandinavian country, they might do something with Norse mythology. But a lot of the mythology films that we get are through an American lens of that mythology, right?
It's funny,
very rare.
speaking of that, like
Yeah, go ahead.
Northmen could fall under this actually.
Yeah,
Speaking of that.
so we
It's
got
kinda
like
crazy.
a
now that you
relatively
said that
smaller
just reminded
one.
me. So
Yeah.
that would be something like that. But Northmen is, you don't have like thousands of dudes fighting
Right.
thousands of dudes, you know?
Right.
Like
The scale isn't there
exactly.
as with this one. But yeah, Osama, yeah.
I'll pass it on right now. Like
Couple
saying
of-
all that
yeah,
to
sorry.
say, it's like such like one of the oldest civilizations in the world that has like thousands of complex stories.
Yeah.
There's a large space for this. So if they keep expanding, they could we were talking about. I was kind of sent a screenshot of the movie that's coming out later this year on September, Brahmastra. So that will build on another kind of universe too. So we'll get. This movie has probably laid down the foundations for that, and I think all these other kind of creatives have Rajamouli to thank for it. Yeah, Sam, I'll pass it on to you. My bad.
Yeah, no. I mean, you're good, man. I'm just gonna again another point in your 360 review that I'll have to just make. Interrupts. Not that I don't. But yeah, I just want to make a few clarifications. So when we talk about the scale of the films, of course, we have to understand that India, specifically Bollywood, for the longest time has been the second largest film industry in the world, if not the largest, especially now considering the wide reach of the international releases. I know they definitely produce and deliver more films per year than Hollywood for sure. But when we're talking about like the reception in terms of box office dollars, I'm sure Hollywood edges that out. But we should acknowledge that this is a big film industry, and I think the genre of these epics and even these stories have existed for a while. But the distinction here is that the scale of which they're being created is recently getting larger and larger, as we saw with
Right.
RRR, right? And I think I read somewhere that Rajamouli's, passion for these stories started when he was a kid reading comics on these different characters, Baahubali, Rama, Mahabharata, etc. Like these old Indian stories that even dating back to like Sanskrit stories that then get adapted decade and decade again, but taking a little bit of a twist on it, making them a little bit more modern. I think maybe I'm remembering this, but I think this film is set in the 8th century, which is not too long ago. And of course, that's pretty loose with, the storytelling, etc., how modern versus how old it is. But it is, I to the original point about the mythological epic stories, if you asked me this question a few months ago, maybe a year ago, I would probably say that I'm really down on fantasy epics as a whole. I'm not someone who's typically, and I think Admir, we maybe have had this conversation on the podcast before, where you and I typically don't tend to get drawn towards the fantasy style genre.
Right.
Whereas Fahad, I know it's a big lure for you, and so coming into even RRR, I saw the reception, and I know just from the comments that were left in that video, as well as just what I've seen online, that Baahubali is a big movie as well. I know it. I going in, I probably knew it was going to be a good film, but I never know exactly what I'm expecting. And for me, I like building worlds and building stories that are still kind of grounded in what is true and what is real that we know around us today. And so it's always scary for me to think about, even when we watch Marvel films, like the extent at which they can get to and the ridiculousness that can come out of these films. And so I think when I watched this film, Baahubali, I think the first half slightly suffered from the extent of the out of the box nature of the film. The fantasy perspective really didn't lend itself too well to the intro, I don't think, because I didn't feel grounded in any kind of story until maybe halfway through the film. And knowing that this was part of a much larger film that was, of course, split into the beginning and the conclusion, it makes a little bit of sense when it comes to the pacing. We talked about this even with the first Lord of the Rings films. I think they both suffer from the same kind of pacing issues where the first half of the film, I didn't really understand what was going on because of the fantasy epic nature to it. But now that I'm thinking back on this question over the past few weeks, having watched RRR, having watched Baahubali, I'm really, especially with the films that we saw this year as well, The Northman, like you mentioned, Fahad, last year with Dune, etc. I'm higher and higher on fantasy epics as a whole, especially ones that are based in some form of literature or old storytelling, because you kind of see a lot of that grandeur being displayed in the films themselves. And so when you have a director like this with a long leash and the ability to continuously make the biggest blockbusters in India, it's really exciting to see those stories come to life in a way that's visually breathtaking, in a way that actually puts you at the edge of your seat where you go, actually, that's insane. I'm not even that big of an pure action fan, but watching this film throughout, I'm like, wow, I'm really being put in that setting. I'm really being put in the environment where I can envision these things that are larger than life. Because you read this in a textbook, you read this in a book, in a fiction book, etc. It doesn't really, it feels really abstract. But then when it comes to life on the big screen, I really enjoyed it. And I'm someone who's grown up, kind of having a slight aversion to Star Wars, having a slight aversion to initially Lord of the Rings at first, and we know I've come around on that. So for me, I think this has been a big part of that over the past few weeks. So it's a 2 cents for me on the genre of fantasy epics, and I'm really looking forward to breaking down the rest of his films for that reason. What about you, Admir?
Yeah, I'm echoing a lot of what you guys have said. So first thing I want to say, so I remember when me and Fahad first met each other, I remember his distinct love of 300, and I didn't quite get it. I remember watching the movie also, and I thought it was like fun. It was, it was a good time. I didn't love it. He really loved the movie, and I remember not getting it, but watching these movies, which he's been exposed to far longer than I have, you see how much 300 either, I don't know, was inspired, did inspire, whichever direction it is, but it's very closely tied. Like I look at that movie now way closer to being associated with like Eastern blockbusters than I do with like Western blockbusters because of the way it was shot, some of the more dramatic moments, some of the more upscale battles that are happening throughout. So just some trivia for folks out there about a young Fahad. But
That's crazy.
I've
actually watched that movie like 7 times.
Yeah,
bro.
I know. Like
I watched
you're a
it
huge
dubbed
fan
in
of it.
Bengali. Like I've watched it dubbed in Bangla like back in the day. So I love that movie.
Yeah.
On that note, Admir, I know we talked about this one specific sequence in 300 a few episodes ago where it was shot with 2 simultaneous cameras, allowing, again, who's the protagonist in 300 again?
Leonidas and Gerard Butler.
Allowing Leonidas in his singular motion fighting through crowds for us to get like a crystal clear zoom in, zoom out, etc. And watching Baahubali last night, there was an exact replica of that shot, and I thought, wow, that was actually really well done. And we talked about it on that episode, so make sure to check it out. I don't even remember which episode that was, but so make sure to check all of them out, I guess, is what I'm saying. But it came yesterday in the movie, and I was like, well, that's really well done. It's a very technically difficult shot to make. And I thought just a lot of those action sequences, of course, I will get to later on, were super emblematic of 300, which we forget came out now
a while ago,
18 years ago. That's 2006.
Yeah.
Sorry, 16 years ago. That's
16.
wild.
Yeah. It's been a long time. No, and when you watch these movies, for me, what ends up happening is you get this fuller understanding of cinema, and like 300 no longer is an outlier. Like in my head, it was always an outlier in how Zack Snyder made the film and where it sits in other action movies, and again, in my head. But watching these other films from Rajamouli, it's not that big of an outlier. It's more sort of, in line with these approaches. But the thing I wanted to say with sort of fantasy epics on the whole, me personally, I'm always down for a long movie. I typically have a long leash for films that are 3+ hours. I don't mind them, I think, as much. So I'm typically okay with that. Funnily enough, though, as you mentioned, Osama, they never have been the fantasy types. For me, the aversion was always the fact that I'm going into this and there's going to be a lot thrown at me, and I feel like I'm going to have to do a lot of work to keep up with what's happening. And it was a little bit I overestimated that problem, right? At the end of the day, these films are made for general audiences. They're not made for a niche audience, right? So the directors, if they're good enough, will carve it in such a way where you're not lost in the details. And Rajamouli very much succeeds in that respect. So props to him on that. The other thing I wanted to say is, at the end of the day, films like this are cultural artifacts to some degree. They're not a historical retelling of actual events, of course not. But at this very moment, it is a capturing of culture in 2015. You know, in was it Southern India, right? That Hollywood's based in, right?
Yeah.
So you have this cultural artifact that somebody from me who's, you know, never been to India, I'm really not exposed to Indian culture, can watch a movie like this and pick up stuff from it, right? Like, I love Greek mythology and, you know, those stories, not just because we learned them in school. It's because I played God of War growing up as a kid. You know, you watch these movies growing up as a kid. You watch these TV shows. You get references consistently across the culture. So it's, you know, to truly understand a mythology and to truly understand these stories, it can't just be, in my opinion, I think, as you mentioned, in textbooks or in just books, right? I think that's a way you get introduced to it, and I think that's a way you can expand your knowledge on these things. But to truly understand the grandeur of these stories, I think film is like the best way to do that, right? It's really the best way to, you know, sear these characters and these stories and these moments into your head. Like we said about 300. I haven't watched 300 in the longest time, right? But some of the visuals and some of those, you know, fight battles and sequences are in my head, and that's the mythology of the 300 Spartans, right? You're forever ingrained with that story. And so I've come to appreciate fantasy epics, especially those that are grounded in some forms of a retelling of mythology, right? Because they give you this gateway into another culture. And so it's of huge importance that these movies get made, not just for an Indian audience to sort of revere their own stories, but also for the rest of us who are not at all accustomed to these stories or used to them to get this insight into what they are. So
Guys, I'm sorry to cut you off, but it looks like we're getting some news now to the OTC penthouse. It seems Admir's Wi-Fi has unfortunately passed away. Now, due to these unforeseen circumstances, for the remainder of this podcast, we will show a picture in his honor. Back to you guys.
The only drawback I have with fantasy epics in general, and I do feel like Rajamouli's stories suffer from that a little bit, is the lack of moral ambiguity in these stories. We mentioned it a little bit before we started recording, and it typically will reside in something like there's clearly a bad person and then there's clearly a good person, and sort of how will it play out, you sort of know ahead of time, and it's more about the journey than the end, and that's perfectly fine. But I do feel like some of the weight of the movie gets lost in these stories when you know the good person sort of will win out, right? And I think that's also something that's typically steered me away from fantasy films. It was one of the drawbacks I had for Lord of the Rings. Like, as much as I liked The Two Towers, for example, the clear dichotomy of bad and evil reduces sort of any sort of tension I as an audience member might have for trying to pick a side, right? And even in RR, where you do have Beam and Ram positioned as sort of against each other, ultimately their goals are very similar. It's more about the way that they go about it. And then, of course, you know, that they end up being on the same page eventually. So I appreciated the introduction of moral ambiguity in that film. In this one, it's severely lacking. Baahubali is clearly the good, you know, brother in this case, and his son is clearly the right descendant to the throne. And it's more about how do we get there. And so for me, moral ambiguity in film forces characters to do things, and we learn about those characters, and I think we learn about ourselves in that process, and they're a little bit lost in sort of these stories, and that's maybe okay. Not every story needs to be this sort of, you know, gray area, retelling. It just seems to be a constant in fantasy epics for me. Whether it's Lord of the Rings, whether it's Star Wars, MCU a little bit, if you want to call that fantasy, and now sort of what Rajamouli's doing. So I don't know if it's something that plagues just the fantasy genre in general. Game of Thrones tried to get away from that a little bit, and I think they did so successfully, barring the end of that story. But it is something I do feel like is lacking in the genre.
You want to talk about it?
Huh? Yeah, the reviews are up for season 8 of Game of Thrones, so you can go watch us be wrong and be hopeful up until the final episode. So you can go listen to that. Fahad was on many of those. He was many on those reviews. But so I'm still 2 cents
before my time.
I don't listen to those clips ever.
I'm 2 cents on
They're
the
my black
genre. Yeah, I'm 2 cents on the genre as a whole. I was engaged with Baahubali a lot more than RRR because of that base and sort of this 8th century
interesting.
sort of setup.